Good morning, and I'll go ahead and call our meeting to order. This is the Oklahoma City MAPS Investment and Operating Trust special meeting of November 15th, 2021. Item number 2 on our agenda is approval of the minutes of our September 7th, 2021 Investment Trust meeting. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to review those. Please vote. Okay, the motion passed. Thank you very much. So now moving on to items, or number 3, items for consideration. A is the custody bank contract between Oklahoma City MAPS Investment Operating Trust and BOKF, DBA Bank of Oklahoma, for a term of 1 year with an option to renew for 4 additional years. Just as a little bit of information, the RFP committee received 3 banks that submitted. This committee was put together in accordance with the City of Oklahoma City's purchasing policies. And once the trust is fully funded, the estimated annual cost will be around $38,000. And the fee is a fixed percentage. So if there's any questions, if not, take a motion in a second. Okay, the motion passes. Thank you. So moving on to item B. This is a resolution authorizing the Secretary and/or the Assistant Secretary of the Oklahoma City MAPS Investment and Operating Trust to affix the signature of the chairperson, vice chairperson, and secretary by manual or electronic signature stamp on any necessary trust documents approved at trust meetings or by obtaining original signatures as needing. And essentially it's not that the signatures are going to be put on without the trust voting on it. This is just simply a matter of ease, so that frankly I'm not running down every time we need something signed. So if there's any questions, okay, motion in a second. I'll cast your vote. Okay, motion passed. Thank you. Moving on to item C. Okay, this one's a little longer, so hang in there with me. Resolution authorizing the city treasurer and the assistant city treasurer to act as a custodian of trust funds, make authorized investments of trust funds in accordance with applicable laws and trust indentures, manage all banking, investment and collateral agreements and relationships, deposit all uninvested trust funds, act as signatories for purposes of opening and closing accounts and making various banking and investment transactions, and approve all banking arrangements in the amount not to exceed $10,000 on behalf of the Oklahoma City MAPS Investment and Operating Trust. So if there's no questions, take a motion in a second. Cast your vote. Motion passes. Great. Okay, so now on to item D. This is the investment policy of the Oklahoma City MAPS Investment and Operating Trust as recommended by the trust investment consultant and co-consulting. Subsequent changes to the policy are expected in the future, and Doug Anderson from &Co is here if there's any questions. So any questions or comments?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that on page 8 of the policy, going on to page 9, we do have some blanks still in the policy, and that's a pretty important part, the asset allocation portion. I feel like this is probably something that needs to be deferred until we can get that determined. I do want to ask either Doug or the city treasurer how that would affect us, how that would slow things down, the receipt of funds, but I feel like that's a pretty important part of the policy that needs to be completed before we could adopt this. But I don't know if you all want to respond to that.
I'm happy to. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
That page is left on page 8 and page 9. The asset allocation is incomplete. I think we've made a good deal of progress on the policy statement so far. We've moved rapidly on it, but this is a very important question. As recently as late last week, we were having conversations on the 4% return target, whether that is before or after inflation, which is something that's a big item recently, and a big question on how we would allocate these funds going forward, especially when you think the 30-year Treasury bond is yielding less than 2% right now. So it is a challenge, whether we're going for 4% target rate of return, real or without inflation, or up to a 10% rate of return if we do consider inflation. So those are miles apart, if you will. Another thing that we were talking about is what the impact or how we should interpret the preservation of capital. Is that an absolute mark at all times? Whereas the trust indenture says preservation and growth at the same time. So we're going through some of the, I guess you would say, the important issues for asset allocation still at this time. And I think it's that's a great question. The question that I have from my perspective advising this board is, if we do approve it, and there's one section in it that's a cash reserve section, but it says that you have to have, the amount of funds you can reserve in cash is somewhat related to what interest rates are in the world. And by that section, we're not allowed to have 100% cash in the portfolio. So in the absence of that, and I want to thank you, Trustee Sudol, that there are important considerations here. It will not slow us down from proceeding on this as long as we can get together and meet about asset allocation and what that looks like before the end of the year. That, I think, requires probably another special meeting or getting together as a group or subgroups to discuss the real impacts of what we are thinking. So as far as opportunity cost, I would say it's unquantifiable. I can't tell what the future is going to be for the next, even if we are delayed from investing the funds for 6 weeks or 2 months, I can't quantify what that opportunity cost will be in advance. But deferring to council, obviously, on this, I think we've made a lot of progress approving a document that's incomplete, even though I noticed on the subtitle it was anticipated changes. Or changes are anticipated to this document in the future. But I want to make sure that we're not obligating ourselves to anything that we're not really ready to right away.
Right.
I have a quick question in regard to, is my mic on? Are the funds subject to distribution based upon this asset allocation being completed? That's my question, and I think that's the question all of us have.
And at this point, the Citizens Advisory Committee has not approved that allocation. So Chair Rose, you probably give us some insight into that. That is in a future agenda of the Citizens Advisory Board. And so we will not receive any funds until they have approved that point. So that's a step that's missing at this point.
And I would say that the anticipation is that at the December board meeting, that Citizens Advisory Board would vote to allocate those funds. But at this point, it would go to the bank. It would go to the custodian, and waiting for the investment policy, the other pieces. So I don't think that if we delayed on accepting the investment policy, that it will delay the movement of those funds.
No, that makes total sense. This is what I thought would happen. It would go to the custodian until this was finalized.
Right. Yeah.
One
Mandy, did you have?
One of the concerns that I have are twofold here. One is with the funds, when we can come back and come up with our, your recommendations on what our mix is and our asset allocation here. But the other one is considering where we are in the times, and we can't lose the corpus. we've got to be somewhat conservative, I would think, starting on the onset, and then as we go, as time passes, we're going to change that to, I would expect, to hire more in equities. So that's what I'm assuming is what we're going to do. And I know you don't have the crystal ball, so you can't predict that.
Right.
But we need to really talk about that, what our plan is for the long term and what it is for the short term.
Right.
And I think, I don't know how we need to do that here on the Horseshoe. I'm perfectly fine talking about it here. If we want to talk about it in briefings, that's fine. So, but to me, we really need to kind of figure that out, I think, before we come back and bring this policy to this board for approval.
Okay. And I would say, as we are, so putting my Citizens Advisory hat on, as we are working more with the timeline of, everybody was excited about the implementation plan and pushing those projects up as quickly as we could. It also means that there's going to be more requests for the operating funds from the trust. So I think the timing of those projects and when they're going to come online and when those operators are going to be needing that operating revenue also is an important character. Because I'll tell you, it's already much faster and earlier than I had even thought. So yeah, I think that there's a whole lot of pieces that need to be put together to figure out what the right investment policy is. So I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so I hope when we come back, we can bring back a policy that has these filled out, one, and two, kind of what our short-term strategy is that may not exactly mirror that.
Right.
And I may be the only one thinking that, but I don't think I am. So, if we could, just so you'll understand.
Yeah.
So that is a material part of this policy, so you all would not be able to vote on it with the blanks in place. You could vote to amend and add the information, but it sounds like you may not have that information at this time. So the best course of action would be to strike the item so you can bring back the completed, updated document for your consideration at your next meeting, whenever that special meeting is determined to be set.
So just to make sure I understand, the funds wouldn't be allocated for our use until sometime in December.
That's my
And
assumption.
Doug, you were saying that, your suggestion would be that we get this in place by the end of the year. So it sounds like we would be looking to have a special meeting sometime between now and that point in time. So I wouldn't think there'd be a significant loss. I mean, certainly there's going to be some loss in regards to not being able to invest, but I think that it's going to fall within the right time frame if we can get a special meeting lined out.
Hey, Teresa, just so I'm clear on this, the timeline for this goes, we approve at the investment trust level, and then it goes to council, or does it fall back to Citizens Advisory Board, or does it just go straight through?
It just goes straight through, or does council have to approve?
This policy is only required to be approved by this trust. It does not have to go on to any other body.
Okay. So Amanda, would we need to vote to strike the item?
Sure, someone should move to strike the item.
I'll make a motion to strike the item.
I second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Please cast your votes. Okay, the motion passes. And I think my hope would be that we could maybe do some of the small group work again with the goal of having a special meeting before the end of the year. I know that's a tight time crunch in a time of year when everybody's busy and got plans to not be here, but if we could accomplish that, I think that we'd be in good shape. Okay. So item E, adoption of the CY22 meeting schedule. You see there, well, let's see, we're looking at February. Do we have this, or is it just in my notes, Matt? Just in my notes. So we're looking at February 21st, May 16th, August 15th, and November 22nd. So February, May, August, and November. And of course, we can have special meetings anytime that we need. So I take a motion in a second. Okay, please cast your votes. Okay, the motion passes, and we'll get those specific dates out to each of you. Our next item is reports, comments from trust staff or interested parties. Do we have anybody signed up? No? Matt?
Yes, and just to reiterate that, yes, so it is anticipated that we'll have the additional special meetings. So what you'd approve is just the regular meetings, those quarterly meetings of the trust, and especially during this first year, I would anticipate a few. It is also worth noting that the individual money managers would be approved by this body before we move forward with making any investments. And so there is still even another step beyond the asset allocation. It's the individual money managers that would be approved before we can go through with the investment. So there's still one more step in that process. Just want to make that clear on the timeline.
Any other comments by trustees?
I have a comment, probably a significant comment about maintaining the corpus. Depending on the timing of these cash flows, if there are needs immediately, then there's going to be some erosion of that balance from the outset. So, I mean, I think that that's the timing of the short term versus long term is critically important, as well as understanding how this money is going to be used, say in the first year, because it's going to take some time for those investments to ramp up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think to Brent's point, understanding the short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals is going to be really critical as we adopt that investment policy. Any other comments? Questions? Brent?
Yes, could you tell us kind of when you expect there to be a need to request some of these funds? Not to put you on the spot, but.
No, that's fine. It is my understanding that the first project that will begin requesting operating funds will be August.
August of 22.
Correct. Now, it is one small project, but it is still, it's still a request. And then probably in about a year and a half after that, and then by 2024 is when we're going to really see, that's when a number of the projects that have operating funds allocated to them will come online.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I also have a question. Are the projects contingent upon, is our timing and strategy contingent on the timing of these projects, or are the projects contingent on when the fund actually starts generating revenue?
The former.
The former? Okay. Didn't want to be the
But
tail.
we're my goal is to weave those together nicely. So.
Don't want to be the tail wagging the
Silk
dog.
rather than burlap.
But we could run into a time where they have a need for a certain amount and we may not have it to provide to them.
Right. Yeah.
And we do have the council passed a resolution of intent on those funds that I think states we're not supposed to, or their intent was that the principal amount would not be spent
The
down
corpus stays
until
whole.
40 years after.
Right. Yep.
After the adoption of the investment policy, the next key document will be the spending policy, which will address some of those situations, because if we have an investment performance year that did not have the yields necessary to meet those operating agreements, we would need to have, whether that's a 3-year average or something, and that's to be determined in the future. But having a solid spending policy that's flexible enough to meet those situations is going to be another important thing to manage using these funds properly.
Mm-hmm. Any other comment, discussion?
Teresa, I don't know if it would be helpful for this trust to have a copy of the timeline from Citizens Advisory Boards, just to see what that looks like and what they have been tasked with on that side of the fence.
No, I think you're right, and I'm so glad that you said what I was thinking, which is when you have those small groups, we need to probably, we probably need to share that with Mr. Anderson and Matt, and have that as one of the critical pieces in building the investment policy. But it's, I mean, it's public, so, but we can get you, we can simplify that process for you. Okay. Other questions, comments? If not, thank you for attending today, and we are adjourned.